April 8th, 1945, 0530 hours. Southern Okinawa. The morning mist clings to the coral ridges like a funeral shroud. In the gray dawn, Marine Corporal James Whitaker crouches behind a shattered limestone outcropping, his Thompson submachine gun slick with the previous night's rain. For 72 consecutive hours, his unit has pushed forward through a landscape that seems designed by nightmare-jogged cliffs, hidden caves, and an enemy who would rather die than surrender. Every yard of ground has cost American blood. Every cave entrance could be a tomb. But something is different this morning. Something that will challenge everything Whitaker and his fellow Marines have been taught about their enemy. The sound reaches them first, not the crack of rifle fire or the whistle of incoming mortars, but something far more unsettling. Voices. Japanese voices. Calling out across no man's land. Not battle cries or defiant shouts, but something that sounds almost like negotiation. Lieutenant Robert Henderson, aged 23 but looking 40 in the half-light, raises his hand to halt his platoon's advance. His intelligence briefings have been clear and consistent since Guadalcanal. Japanese soldiers do not surrender. The Bushido code forbids it. Death before dishonor. Fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. In 3 years of island hopping across the Pacific, Henderson has seen perhaps a dozen Japanese soldiers surrender out of hundreds of thousands encountered. The ratio isn't just unusual. It's culturally incomprehensible to American military thinking. "Sir," whispers Sergeant Thomas McKinley, there waving something white. Henderson's field glasses come up slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he doesn't trust what he's about to see. Through the magnified circle of vision, the impossible crystallizes into reality. Emerging from a cave entrance 200 yards distant are Japanese soldiers not charging, not fighting, but walking forward with their hands raised. Behind them, more soldiers appear, and more still. Within the next 6 hours, United States Marines will accept the surrender of more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers in a single concentrated action. It will be one of the largest mass surrenders of Japanese forces in the entire Pacific War. And it will happen so quickly, so unexpectedly, that it will temporarily overwhelm the Marine Corps prisoner processing capabilities. The event will send shockwaves through both American and Japanese military commands, raising questions that cut to the heart of warfare, culture, and what happens when the unthinkable becomes unavoidable. This is not a story about a great battle. This is a story about the moment when reality collided with ideology, when survival instinct overcame cultural conditioning, and when two enemies briefly set aside their weapons to confront a more complex truth about human nature in war. The Battle of Okinawa had been raging for 7 days when this remarkable event unfolded. Operation Iceberg, as it was called, represented the final stepping stone before an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa was Japanese territory, not a conquered possession, but part of the homeland itself. For the Japanese military command, losing Okinawa meant exposing Japan proper to direct assault. For American planners, taking Okinawa meant establishing air bases within easy striking distance of Tokyo and creating staging grounds for Operation Downfall. The planned invasion of Japan, the numbers involved were staggering. The United States committed 182,000 ground troops to the initial assault, supported by the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific, more than 1,300 ships. Against them, the Japanese 32nd Army had dug in with approximately 77,000 troops, supplemented by 39,000 locomotives. Unlike previous Iowan campaigns, where Japanese forces met Americans on the beaches, General Masaru Ushijima had devised a different strategy. His forces had withdrawn into Okinawa's mountainous southern interior, where they had spent months creating an interconnected fortress of caves, tunnels, and underground positions. They would not waste lives in glorious but futile beach charges. Instead, they would bleed the Americans in a war of attrition among the ridges and dross, in places that would soon earn names stained with blood: Kakazo Ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill. The young men emerging with raised hands on that April morning were not the cream of Japan's military establishment. Most belonged to the 24th Division, recently transferred from Manchuria to reinforce Okinawa's defenses. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly cut off from their command structure. American naval gunfire and carrier aircraft had systematically destroyed Japanese supply lines. What food reached the southern positions was meager and irregular. Water was scarce. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. 4 days, These soldiers had watched their comrades die not from enemy bullets but from infected wounds, dysentery, and starvation. But material deprivation alone does not explain what happened on April 8th. Japanese soldiers had endured worse on New Guinea, on Japan, on They had fought to annihilation on island after island, choosing death over the shame of capture. The military code they had been raised with since childhood, the Senjinkun Field Service Code, explicitly stated that soldiers should never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Do not live in shame as a prisoner, it commanded. Die, to ensure you do not leave behind a dishonorable name. So what changed? The answer lies partly in the words of one man, Private First Class Shinji Nakamura, who would later be interviewed by American intelligence officers. Nakamura, aged 19, had been conscripted 8 months earlier. Unlike career soldiers or officers, he and many others in his unit were recent draftees, pulled from farms and factories as Japan's manpower crisis deepened. They had received abbreviated training weeks instead of months, and their indoctrination into Bushido culture. While present lacked the depth of earlier classes of soldiers, we had not eaten properly for 6 days. Nakamura would recount through a translator. The officers kept promising that supplies would arrive, that reinforcements would come, that we would... But nothing came. No supplies, no reinforcements, no orders that made sense. On the 7th day, our lieutenant was killed by a mortar fragment. The sergeant took command, but he was wounded too. We had perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition between 20 men. New grenades. No way to fight. Here was the critical element, the breakdown of command structure. Japanese military culture emphasized absolute obedience to one's superior officers. A soldier might resist surrender on his own initiative, but if his commanding officer was dead and if no clear orders existed, a vacuum formed. Into that vacuum came something unexpected. A psychological operations campaign that American forces had been developing throughout the Pacific War, but which reached unprecedented sophistication on Okinawa. Marine intelligence officers had been working closely with Japanese prisoners of war, the precious few who had been developed surrender appeals. These prisoners, known as Nisei, when they were Japanese Americans serving as translators, would record messages on phonograph records that were then broadcast through powerful loudspeakers positioned near Japanese lines. The messages were carefully crafted. They did not mock or insult. They did not demand immediate capitulation. Instead, they spoke to the reality of the situation in terms that acknowledged Japanese cultural concepts while offering a dignified way out. Your situation is hopeless. One message declared in flawless Japanese. Your officers have lied to you. No reinforcements are coming. No supplies are coming. The American fleet controls all waters around Okinawa. The American Air Force controls all skies. You have fought with honor and courage. No one can question your dedication, but continuing to fight serves no purpose except to ensure your death and the deaths of your comrades. The war is lost. You know this in your hearts. Surrender is not dishonor when your cause is already defeated and your death serves no strategic purpose. These messages played continuously, hour after hour, day after day. At first, Japanese troops tried to ignore them or drown them out with their own songs and shouts, but as conditions worsened, as hunger gnawed at their bellies and wounds festered untreated, the words began to penetrate. The psychological pressure was immense. In traditional Japanese military thinking, surrender was individual shame. But what if the entire unit was destroyed, not through heroic combat, but through slow starvation and disease? What if dying in a cave, unfound and unremembered, was actually less honorable than acknowledging defeat and potentially living to rebuild Japan after the war? On the evening of April 7th, a small group of Japanese soldiers in what Americans designated as Cave Complex 14 held a discussion that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the few NCOs still alive in his unit, faced a choice that tore at everything he had been taught. His men were dying, not from battle wounds, but from infected cuts, from dysentery, from simple malnutrition. They had no ammunition left. No food. The only water came from a contaminated trickle that was making men sicker. His commanding officers were all dead. The unit was surrounded. We debated for hours. Yamamoto would later tell interrogators. Some men said we should wait for orders. Others said we should attempt a bonsai charge die in combat like warriors. But I had to ask, who would we be dying for? Our families, Japan, the emperor? Or would we be dying only because we were too afraid of shame to choose life? The question was profound and dangerous. It struck at the very foundation of the mythology that had sustained Japanese military culture, and once truly contemplated, the answer seemed suddenly obvious to exhausted, starving men who had watched their friends die for weeks in conditions that served no strategic purpose. Yamamoto made a decision. Using a torn white undershirt tied to a bamboo pole, he would approach the American lines at dawn and attempt to negotiate surrender for his unit. If the Americans killed him during the approach, well, that would be an honorable death in combat. But if they allowed him to surrender, he would offer to bring out his entire group. When Lieutenant Henderson first spotted Corporal Yamamoto emerging from the cave entrance at 0530 hours on April 8th, he had no idea he was witnessing the beginning of a cascade. Standard procedure required Henderson to call for a Japanese-speaking translator and process the surrender carefully. Corporal Yamamoto, through gestures and a few words of broken English, indicated that more men were willing to surrender. Many more. Henderson faced his own crisis of decision. Accepting a mass surrender in an active combat zone carried enormous risks. What if it was a trick? What if the surrendering soldiers were actually covering for an attack? Japanese forces had used false surrenders before, though rarely. The tactical situation was fluid. Other units were still engaged in heavy combat just a few hundred yards away. Processing prisoners would pull Marines away from fighting positions. And yet, if this surrender was genuine, it represented both a significant tactical victory and a crucial intelligence opportunity. Henderson called for reinforcements and translators. He established the surrender protocol. Japanese soldiers would emerge from the caves in small groups, hands clearly visible, moving slowly toward designated collection points. Marine sharpshooters covered every angle. Combat engineers stood ready to seal cave entrances if this proved to be an ambush. Medical corpsmen prepared to treat wounded prisoners both for humanitarian reasons and because wounded prisoners often provided the most candid intelligence. The first group came out-12 men, emaciated and frightened. They were searched, given water, and moved to a secured area. Henderson waited for an ambush that never came. Then the second group emerged, 20 men, then a third group, then suddenly, as if a dam had broken, soldiers began streaming out of multiple cave entrances across the hillside. Men who had been hiding in terror, men who had been wounded and immobile, men who had been on the edge of starvation all emerged into the morning light. The scene became almost surreal. Marine infantrymen, who minutes before had been preparing to assault these positions with flamethrowers and demolition charges, now found themselves distributing water and rations to enemy soldiers who bowed in gratitude. Japanese soldiers who had been prepared to die defending their positions instead sat in neat rows, finally able to rest without fear of death raining down from the sky. Some wept openly. Others sat in shocked silence, as if unable to process that they were still alive. By 0800 hours, Henderson's company had processed more than 300 surrenders. By 1000 hours, the number exceeded 600. Other Marine units, seeing what was happening and hearing the radio reports, began their own loudspeaker appeals to nearby Japanese positions. The psychological effect was exponential. Once a few units surrendered, others began to question why they were still fighting. The cultural taboo against surrender, while still powerful, had been cracked. "I've been fighting in the Pacific for 2 years," Sergeant McKinley muttered to another NCO as they watched another group of 50 Japanese soldiers file past with their hands up. "I never thought I'd see this. Not ever. These boys fight like devils. They charge machine guns, they blow themselves up rather than quit, and now they're just walking in. Hundreds of them." The logistics of processing so many prisoners so quickly became the next challenge. Marine units had prepared to handle perhaps a dozen prisoners per day, not hundreds per hour. Interpreters were overwhelmed. Guards had to be pulled from frontline positions. Food and water supplies intended for the advancing Marines had to be diverted to keep prisoners alive. Medical corpsmen found themselves treating Japanese soldiers with wounds that had gone untreated for weeks, infections that had turned injuries that would have killed them within days. By 1200 hours on April 8th, the count exceeded 1,000. The surrenders had spread across multiple cave complexes as word traveled through the underground network. Japanese soldiers used their own communication tunnels to pass the message. Surrender was happening. Surrender was being accepted. The Americans were not executing prisoners, but treating them fairly. Fear of torture or execution had kept many Japanese soldiers fighting long after hope was lost. Now, seeing their comrades treated humanely, that fear dissolved. American intelligence officers descended on the prisoner collection points like hungry hawks. This was an unprecedented intelligence windfall. They began systematic interrogations, learning details about Japanese defensive positions, minefields, artillery, placements, unit strengths, and command structures. Every piece of information could save American lives in the battles to come. Some prisoners cooperated readily, eager to help end a war they now saw as lost. Others remained silent, still bound by loyalty, even in defeat. A few expressed contempt for their comrades who had surrendered, seeing them as traitors to everything they had been taught. The reaction from Japanese command was swift and vicious. Radio intercepts showed General Ushijima's headquarters issuing furious orders. Units that had surrendered were declared traitors. Their families would be informed of their disgrace. Officers who allowed their units to surrender would be posthumously stripped of rank. The military police, the Kenpatai, would deal harshly with anyone who encouraged defeatism. But these threats rang hollow to men who were starving in caves, watching their comrades die in agony, and realizing that their deaths would serve no purpose except to briefly delay the inevitable. The mass surrender of April 8th represented only a fraction of the carnage to come at Okinawa. The battle would rage for another 75 days, becoming the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. By the time organized Japanese resistance ended on June 22nd, American forces would suffer more than 49,000 casualties, including 12,500 killed or missing. Japanese military casualties exceeded 110,000, with only 7,400 prisoners, testament to how rare and significant the April 8th mass surrender truly was. The civilian population suffered catastrophically, with estimates of civilian deaths ranging from 40,000 to 150,000. Okinawa became a preview of what an invasion of mainland Japan might look like, a bloodbath of unimaginable proportions. The strategic implications of the April 8th surrenders rippled through American military planning. If Japanese soldiers could be induced to surrender in numbers rather than fighting to annihilation, it might be possible to end the war without the massive casualties predicted for Operation Downfall. Psychological warfare programs were immediately expanded. Surrender leaflets were redesigned based on lessons learned from Okinawa. Broadcasts were increased in frequency and sophistication. The message was refined. Surrender is not personal dishonor when your cause is strategically defeated and your leaders have failed you. But the surrenders also highlighted a darker reality that American planners could not ignore. The vast majority of Japanese soldiers on Okinawa still chose death over surrender. Even as their situation became hopeless, even as they watched comrades surrender, most fought on. Some launched suicidal bonsai charges. Others sealed themselves in caves and detonated explosives, choosing to be buried alive rather than captured. The cultural conditioning was that powerful. The fear of shame, of dishonoring family, of violating the warrior code. These forces were stronger than the survival instinct for tens of thousands of men. American military psychologists studied the April 8th surrender intensively, trying to understand the factors that made it possible. Their analysis identified several critical elements: the breakdown of command structure that left men without clear orders, the extended period of physical suffering that wore down resistance, the carefully calibrated psychological operations that offered a culturally acceptable rationalization for surrender, the visible humane treatment of early surrenders that dispelled fears of torture or execution, and perhaps most importantly, the collective nature of the surrender that diffused individual shame. A Japanese soldier will almost never surrender as an individual, wrote Captain Harold Yost, a Marine intelligence officer who processed many of the April 8th prisoners. The shame is too great. But if his entire unit surrenders together, if his commanding officers are dead and no orders exist forbidding it, if he can rationalize that he fought honorably but was defeated by circumstances beyond his control, then surrender becomes psychologically possible. We learned at Okinawa that breaking the cultural barrier to surrender requires addressing not just material conditions, but cultural and psychological factors. We learned that shame can be collective as well as individual, and that removing the shame through careful messaging and humane treatment can save thousands of lives on both sides. The individual stories that emerged from interrogations painted vivid pictures of the human reality behind the statistics. Private Nakamura, aging 19, had lied about his age to avoid conscription, but was eventually drafted anyway. He had never wanted to be a soldier. His family grew rice in a small village near Osaka. He had planned to take over the family farm, marry his childhood sweetheart, and live a simple life. Instead, he found himself in a cave on Okinawa, watching friends die, wondering if anyone would even know where he had perished. When the opportunity to surrender came, he seized it without hesitation. "I wanted to live," he told his interrogator simply. "I wanted to see my family again." "Is that so shameful?" Corporal Yamamoto, the NCO who had led the initial surrender approach, struggled more deeply with his decision. In interrogation, he maintained his dignity and military bearing even in captivity. "I do not regret my choice," he stated carefully. "My men were dying for no reason. As their leader, I had a duty to preserve their lives if possible. But I know that in Japan, my family will be told I am a traitor. My name will be erased. My children, if I have children, will carry this shame. I understand this. I accept it. But I also accept that I could not watch my men die in darkness, forgotten, serving no purpose. I chose life and shame over death and honor. History will judge if I chose correctly." Some prisoners admitted they had been on the verge of suicide before the surrender option appeared. Japanese soldiers carried grenades specifically for this purpose to blow themselves up rather than face capture. The psychological torment of deciding whether to pull that pin to end everything in one final explosion had driven several men to the edge of madness. When surrender became possible, it represented not just physical salvation but psychological relief from an impossible choice. The American Marines who processed these surrenders underwent their own transformation. Men who had been trained to see Japanese soldiers as fanatical enemies suddenly confronted their humanity. These were not demons or robots programmed to die. They were young men, tired and scared, who wanted to live. They missed their families. They hated the war. They had simply been caught in a historical machinery far larger than themselves. The act of treating enemy soldiers humanely, of giving them water and medical care, of recognizing their humanity, it changed how many Marines thought about their enemy and about war itself. "I'll still fight them when I have to," Sergeant McKinley wrote in a letter home that week. "But I'll never again think they're not human. They bleed red like us. They hurt like us. They want to go home like us. This damn war has made everyone into something they never wanted to be." The news of the mass surrender reached the United States within days, though military censors carefully controlled how it was reported. The American public fed a steady diet of stories about fanatical Japanese soldiers who fought to the death, found the surrender reports difficult to reconcile with their understanding of the enemy. Some newspapers emphasized it as proof that Japan was crumbling and the war would soon be won. Others worried it might be a trick or anomaly. Military analysts, however, recognized it as a potentially war-altering development if the lessons could be properly applied. In Japan, the military government suppressed all information about the Okinawa surrenders. Such news was considered dangerous defeatism that could undermine fighting spirit on the home islands. Families of the surrendered soldiers were not officially notified. In many cases, they were simply told their sons or husbands had died honorably in combat. The truth was too shameful to acknowledge. Even after the war ended, many of these men faced social ostracism when they returned to Japan. They had violated the deepest taboo of their culture, and forgiveness did not come as the strategic impact of Okinawa and specifically of cases like the April 8th surrenders directly influenced American decision-making regarding the use of atomic weapons. Military planners projected that invading the Japanese home islands would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. The fact that even in the hopeless conditions of Okinawa, the vast majority of Japanese soldiers still chose death over surrender suggested that an invasion would be even more costly than worst-case scenarios predicted. These calculations, combined with the desire to end the war before Soviet entry into the Pacific conflict, contributed to President Truman's decision to authorize the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ethical complexity of this decision continues to be debated, but the Okinawa experience provided concrete data that shaped those debates. American military leadership saw firsthand both the potential for Japanese surrender under extreme conditions and the cultural barriers that made such surrender rare even in the face of certain death. They concluded that only a shock of unprecedented magnitude, something beyond conventional military defeat, could overcome those barriers and force a Japanese surrender before an invasion became necessary. After the war ended, military historians and psychologists continued to study the April 8th Okinawa surrender as a unique case study. It represented a moment when cultural programming, material conditions, military strategy, and individual human choice intersected in unexpected ways. The lessons learned influenced everything from Cold War psychological operations to modern military training on cultural awareness and the treatment of prisoners of war. For the individual soldiers involved, both American and Japaneses, the experience left marks that lasted lifetimes. The Marines who processed those surrenders carried memories of young men emerging from caves, blinking in the sunlight, grateful to be alive. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered carried the weight of their decision, forever caught between the life they preserved and the honor code they violated. Some would eventually reconcile these contradictions. Others never would. Private Nakamura survived the war and returned to his village near Osaka. He found his family's farm largely intact, but discovered that his childhood sweetheart had been told he died in battle and had married another man. He rebuilt his life slowly, never speaking publicly about his surrender until decades later when he was interviewed by a Japanese historian studying the Pacific War. "I am grateful to be alive," he said in that interview. Now an old man, "I do not regret my choice, but I also understand why others chose differently. War asks impossible things of young men and then judges them harshly for the choices they make. I was lucky. I had a moment when survival became possible. Many others never got that moment." The cave complexes where these surrenders occurred remain on Okinawa today, silent monuments to the battle that raged there. Tourists visit, often unaware of the specific events that transpired in these locations. But for those who know the history, these caves represent something profound, a moment when the machinery of war briefly stopped, when enemies became human to each other, when survival instinct overcame cultural conditioning, and when young men on both sides glimpsed the possibility that war might not have to end in mutual annihilation. The mass surrender of April 8, 1945 did not end the Battle of Okinawa. It did not prevent the atomic bombings that would come months later. It did not erase the massive casualties that both sides would continue to suffer. But it did prove something that military strategists had doubted, that Japanese soldiers could surrender in significant numbers if conditions and psychology aligned correctly. It proved that cultural conditioning, no matter how deep, could be overcome by extreme circumstances and careful psychological operations. And it proved that even in the darkest moments of a brutal war, humanity could reassert itself in unexpected ways. The photographs taken that day show something remarkable. American Marines standing beside Japanese soldiers, both groups looking exhausted and relieved. In some images, Marines are lighting cigarettes for prisoners. In others, medics are bandaging Japanese wounds. The war would continue. Hatred would continue. Killing would continue. But for a few hours on that April morning in southern Okinawa, something different happened. Two groups of young men, thrown into combat by forces beyond their control, acknowledged their shared humanity and chose life over death, pragmatism over ideology, survival over honor. It was not heroic in the traditional sense. No one stormed a beach or held off an attack. But in its own way, it was profoundly courageous, the courage to violate every cultural norm you have been taught, to risk eternal shame, to choose an uncertain future over a certain death, to lay down weapons when every instinct screams to keep fighting. For the United States military, April 8th provided crucial lessons about psychological warfare, cultural understanding, and the conditions under which enemies might surrender for the Japanese military. It exposed the limitations of ideological indoctrination when confronted with hopeless material conditions. For the individuals involved on both sides, it provided a glimpse of war's complexity the way it reduces vast ideological conflicts to immediate human choices: to kill or spare, to fight or surrender, to live your jive. History remembers Okinawa primarily for its casualties and brutality, as well it should. The battle was hell on earth. But within that hell, the mass surrender of April 8th stands as a reminder that even in war, human beings retain the capacity for rational choice, for survival instinct, for seeing the humanity in their enemies. It does not redeem war or make it noble. It simply reminds us that war is ultimately conducted by human beings, with all their complexity, contradictions, and capacity for unexpected decisions. The young men who emerged from those caves on that April morning made a choice that their culture had taught them was worse than death. Many would spend the rest of their lives reconciling that choice with their values and identity. But they lived. They went home. They rebuilt. And in leaving, they carried forward lessons about the costs of war, the complexity of honor, and the profound difficulty of the choices that combat forces upon young men who never asked to be soldiers in the first place. In the end, the mass surrender at Okinawa stands as one of history's paradoxes, an event both remarkable and tragic. A moment of humanity within inhumanity, a surrender that saved lives while revealing the depths of suffering that made it necessary. It was not a victory or a defeat in the traditional sense. It was simply a moment when reality overcame ideology, when survival overcame shame, and when the unthinkable became necessary. The lessons of that day in April 1945 echo still in military doctrine, in cultural studies, and in our understanding of what war demands of those who fight it. And for the survivors, both those who surrendered and those who accepted surrender, it remained a defining moment. A choice that shaped the rest of their lives. A memory both haunting and somehow, against all odds, redemptive.